I'm Lloyd Holiday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. The cost of a thing is the amount of time that you must spend working to buy the things that you want and need. And that directly determines your standard of living. And the American standard of living is what this podcast is all about. And I'm going to be discussing anything that affects that standard of living, especially those things that affect it negatively. And especially those things that have lowered our standard of living from the one that we had in America here in the 1960s, which was better than the one today. And why am I doing this? Because I don't see the government addressing these issues. I don't see the media addressing these issues. They've either forgotten them or ignored them. And these are some of the most important things that determine, of course, how we're going to live, how well we're going to live in the world today, especially for the young people. Okay, this is podcast 17, and I'm still doing my top 10 super ripoffs. And I'm going to be doing my super ripoff number 7. You can see super ripoffs number 1 through 6. I've already got those videos out there in the last few months. And super ripoff number 7 is the government statistic super ripoff. Okay, and what I mean by government statistic super ripoff is the government has, in the last 20 or 30 years, recalculated how they do their statistics for certain things, especially inflation and the GDP, the gross domestic product calculations, and also unemployment. Those three statistics, I'm going to talk about those mainly today. There's many more, but I'm just going to lead in to this government statistics super ripoff with those three. And I'll say them again. Inflation, their inflation calculation, their gross domestic product calculation, and their unemployment calculation. Those are three big statistics that the government uses to gauge how good the economy is doing. In order to show that the economy is doing great, the government has changed how they calculate inflation, GDP, and the unemployment statistics over the past 20 or 30 years or so. And what I'm saying is those are fake calculations. They're not real. They're designed to make the statistics look good so that the politicians look good. And then they can say that, of course, that the economy is doing good, and then, of course, that makes them look good, right? So that's why they do it. So the government is fudging the statistics to make them look better, to make themselves look better, and to fool people into thinking that things are better today than they were in the 1960s, and they're not. So I'm going to take each of these, the three, inflation, then GDP, and then unemployment, and kind of show what they've done to try to dress these up and make them look better so that they can say that things are doing better than they've ever been. The economy is doing better than ever. Okay, so let's look at inflation. And I'm just going to go briefly through this. I'm not going to go into great detail. I'm just going to show what I see that they've done and that many, many other people also see that they've done in faking this current inflation number, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index that they use to show what the inflation level is annually in the United States. And to do that, we'll take a look back in the 1960s and 70s and even the 80s and show how they calculated the inflation statistic back then. Well, what they did back then is they included house prices in there, and they had like a basket of goods that people bought, products that people needed to buy, then they would see how much those went up in price each month or each year, and then they would calculate the inflation rate based on those. And that's how they did it for a very long time. And they had trouble in controlling inflation back in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. Inflation was very high, and they didn't like that. They could never control it. They tried everything. They tried price controls. I think the Nixon years, they tried price controls. Whip Inflation Now was a program they had back in the 70s, I remember, trying to control inflation. They never really could do it by those programs. Inflation just kept going. So what did they do? They couldn't stop inflation. So what they did is they said, hey, let's change the way we calculate it. So one of the main things they did, and I think this was in the early 90s they did this, they took out house price inflation. They took it out of the inflation calculation, the CPI, altogether. They've got some rent equivalent thing in there that just does nothing to show the true inflation that's going on in house prices and so forth. And they don't want to show the house price inflation. They want house prices to be able to go up to $1 million a piece or more, and they can say there's no inflation. So they took that out. They took house prices out of the inflation calculation, and I think that's one of the biggest rip-offs that they ever did, and that's why we have runaway house prices. One of the reasons right now is because now they're not trying to control house price inflation at all because it's not shown in the calculation. And that's one of the things they took out. Now, they did many, many other things, and I'm not going to go into every detail of that today. I'll cover that in future podcasts. But they have done other things, such as replacing, say, steak. They took steak, say if you like to eat beef steak. They now said, well, they don't have to buy beef steak. We can replace that with ground beef, stuff like that. So that you're not really getting the same product, and they're not tracking the inflation of the steak anymore, the beef steak. They're just going, well, the guy could buy a hamburger instead of steak and still get it for the same price, so there's no inflation. They've done things like that. And also they've done hedonics, they call it, hedonics. And I don't want to get into very much detail on hedonics today, but that's another one they've done to suppress the inflation rate. It's like saying that you're getting more value out of your car because it's got, airbags or some other advancement. Really, the car is more expensive, and you're trying to say, no, it's not more expensive, you get airbags. Well, what if you didn't want airbags? Something like, things like that. But the price of the cars are going up, and they're not tracking the complete cost. They're saying, no, the cars are better made, so you're getting more value, and they're doing all kinds of trickery like that to keep the prices, to keep the inflation down, but really the prices still go up. And so that's one of the biggest super rip-offs the government statistics was the inflation calculation, the changes in the inflation calculation to make it look like there's less inflation than there is. And as I've gone into in several of my other videos about inflation, the government now says the inflation rate is so low through the Federal Reserve and so forth, they're saying we need more inflation. We have to lower interest rates so we get more inflation. See, now, since they've changed this calculation, they're not getting enough inflation. They say they want at least 2%. According to their calculations, but with their calculations, they're not even getting that because it's a fake calculation. They're not using the real calculation. It's a little complicated, but not really. You see what they're doing? They're trying to show that inflation is low, and what they've done is they haven't fixed the inflation. They fixed the calculation of the inflation. That is the big statement. I'll say it again. They haven't fixed inflation. It's still there. House prices are going up all the time. And a lot of the other prices are going up. They're just not showing it in their calculations so they can say, no, there's no inflation here. And that's a big lie, and that's the ripoff. Okay, now let's look at another statistic that the government calculates every quarter. It's the gross domestic product, they call it, the GDP. And all that means is all the money spent on all the goods and services in the United States. Okay, all the money spent on all the goods and services bought in the United States that quarter. Well, of course, the government likes to show that the GDP is going up every quarter, and they like to see it anywhere from 3 to 4% if they can get it that high. That shows that they're creating growth in the economy, according to them. So, to get a proper and correct GDP number every quarter, the inflation for that quarter, the increase in inflation, has to be subtracted off of the GDP, the true inflation number. In other words, how much of the money that was spent extra in that quarter from the previous quarter was due to inflation, has to be subtracted off of the GDP. But since they've got a phony inflation calculation that understates inflation every quarter, it never gets subtracted off, and the GDP looks better, looks higher, and a lot of that is just money is spent on higher prices that they don't keep track of. They don't count in their inflation calculation, so it never gets subtracted off. So a lot of the GDP gain is just inflation that they're counting. Yeah, certainly for house prices, it's one. So that's how they're fudging the GDP. Okay, then we come to the third statistic here in this podcast that the government is using, that the government is fudging, that's what I call it, is the unemployment statistic. And we've all heard about this. What they've done, they used to count everybody that was unemployed that wanted a job in the old days. So that was how they got their unemployment number back in the old days. A percentage of people out there that were not working, that wanted a job. And usually it was in the 5 or 6% range in the 60s and 70s. Sometimes it would go up quite high during recessions. And now what they're doing now when they calculate it, they're only counting people as unemployed if they're receiving unemployment benefits or if they're really seriously looking for a job. It doesn't matter if there's any jobs out there to get. They've got to really seriously be looking for a job, and they've got a set of criteria that determine, they ask you these questions and this criteria to determine if you're seriously looking for a job. And if you don't meet that criteria, you're not considered unemployed. You're just somebody who really doesn't want a job, even though you do. So as you can see, with the inflation, they fixed the calculation so that inflation appears low, which is what they want. They want it to be low and tell everybody that inflation is really low. We're doing a good job controlling it. Then, on the other thing with GDP, the government wants to show that number as high as they can to show that they're creating good growth in the economy with their policies. And so that's what they've done with that one. They've fixed it, they've budgeted it, whatever you want to call it, so that it looks as high as possible. And, by not subtracting out all the inflation off that GDP, they can make it look higher than it is. And then, of course, unemployment, we all know they want to make that look as low as possible, and they've done that by culling out people who are not, who the government feels is not looking for a job hard enough, even though they would like a job and no jobs exist that they would want to take or can take, that they are not unemployed. They're just disgruntled workers, or they basically the people that they don't count as unemployed are just, they consider to be people who don't really want to work that bad. And there's many other statistics, probably every one of them, they're tweaking them and recalculating them to make them look as good as possible from the calculations they had in the old days, which were, I believe, they were more real or very real. They told the truth before they started getting with their fancy footwork. And so that, like I said, they haven't fixed the problems. They fixed the calculation of the statistics to make these statistics look good when they really aren't any better, or maybe even a lot worse than they used to be when they calculated them using real numbers and real techniques. So that's the government statistic ripoff, and it's a big one because we can't see that things are getting worse when they're faking the statistics to make them look better. Thank you for listening in today, and until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.